Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if at all, not as lost violent souls, but only as the hollow men. T.S. Eliot. Welcome, Dark Souls fans, the new and the old alike, to a tale that spans millennia. From times that were gray to times of light, from Lord Gwyn to the Champion of Ash, the Dark Souls franchise has reached its inevitable conclusion. That is to say, it has a conclusion. A conclusion that could prove to be the ending of the series if series creator Hidetaka Miyazaki is to be believed, and if such a supposition is indeed proven true, fans of the series should be pleased with how it goes out. I stated prior to the release of Dark Souls 3 that Dark Souls lives more as a lifestyle to me than any other media that exists. Its theses of death and rebirth, its trials presented, the task it would have you complete. There's an undeniable chord of truth that echoes through the stillness of every corner of Dark Souls. You are in danger, you are alone, you are going to die. It's macabre but fascinating. It peels back a layer of subconscious and grips you so tight you'll feel constricted, handicapped even, but determined. It's genuine, it's primitive, and at its core, it strikes an undeniable consonance to the journey of life. The world is full of winners and losers, people who come into our lives and share the bonfire, others who simply fade away. The contrast drawn between Lothric and Lordran before it to our own journey is what separates this series apart from nearly every version of media prior. If it were a movie, it would feel self-righteous. If it were a book, it would feel detached. As something you actually take direct control of, it's a chilling parallel to life. On the mechanical side of things, there is little that has changed about what worked so well in the previous entries. Sure, Estus is modified and sword arts exist, but in truth it just takes what is already the best combat mechanics in gaming and adds little tweaks instead of overhauls. Much about what works in Dark Souls 3, and very little that doesn't, relies on your previous experience with the series. The combat is no different. There are different classes that all start with different weaknesses and strengths. There's your typical range of melee to magic, with an added emphasis on auditioning something in between. It's not like these types of characters weren't possible to create in previous Souls entries, but it feels more encouraged here. And while you may be better off knowing exactly how you want to handle each encounter from the get-go, the game wants to give you the option of trying something new. Or rather, it wants to tell you that any upgrade path you choose is viable, which is important. Despite the incredible journey that the game sends you on, all of it would mean nothing if it had a system of progression that didn't feel like it was working. And speaking of that journey, nostalgia is the flavor of the day. Some characters return-ish, plot points are renewed, and the doors are still extraordinarily heavy. The use, or overuse rather, of familiarity began to wear on me very quickly. Not because I wasn't enjoying the callbacks, I loved them in fact. That is to say, I loved that it cared about being a sequel to Dark Souls, whereas Dark Souls 2 really didn't. But I wasn't comfortable with it at the expense of the narrative. Those fears faded a bit over the course of my first 10 hours or so with the experience. When you begin exploring through the meat of the game, your fears will diminish, but will never fully dissipate. Maybe that's a tad unfair. It's not as if Dark Souls and Demon Souls and now Bloodborne haven't shared similar characters, for instance, or the same character in one specific instance before, patches. But in a story that relies so much on familiarity, when indirect or direct, in this case, equivalences are being drawn, it does have a negative effect on pathos. And that seems to be the overarching negative to Dark Souls 3. It's an amazing game, but it's not fresh, which is perhaps the most unfair criticism I could levy at the series, particularly when the series itself has spawned a whole genre or subgenre of gaming. So with that stated, I should put a cap on the negativity and readdress the critique from another angle.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, the fire fades. We've dealt with this before, but we're not a chosen undead in this game, we're one of the unkindled. We're to bring the Lords of Cinder, or previous champions of their respective timelines, together to relink the fire. What knowledge you gain about this specific cycle is that you're really not the chosen one. That's not a joke or a narrative trick like the Bell of Awakening in Dark Souls 1. It appears you've only risen in this specific space and time because someone else is the chosen one and is refusing to link the fire themselves. If the world felt like it was ending in Dark Souls, it feels like it's already ended in Dark Souls 3. I think with that said, it's safe to assume that in Dark Souls canon, the chosen undead must have linked the fire. The Dark Lord ending doesn't seem to hold water for sequels if indeed the fate of the unkindled is directly linked to someone's irreverence to the tradition of linking the flame. Of course, the lore leaves that open as well. Inevitably, there will be embers that dance across the darkness, Time is convoluted in Lordran, or Lothric, or even Drain Lake, I suppose, in a sort of preemptive attempt at retcon. But even if it's chicanery, it serves the lore more than it detracts. There is a through line to Dark Souls that exists, and then there's your own personal interpretation of events. Both are valid, and to get the most out of Dark Souls 3's story, why not use both? Sequels to Dark Souls aren't fresh, and the way waves crashing on the ocean all look the same. The differences appear mundane, but that's not accounting for their journey across the ocean. Dark Souls continues to be a shared experience. Truly, it's the lore, sure, but it's also the summoning, the invasions. Yes, even these virtual fight clubs. We test each other just as the game tests us. The community is among the most healthy of all video game communities out there. It teaches that they can rely on one another in the game's most advocating moments. Even invasions do that. They strip away any perceived entitlement that comes with victory. No matter how high you climb or how far you get, there's always someone who can take it away and send you tumbling back down. The heartfelt camaraderie between those that would help or destroy you is cultivating for real life. I respect the hell out of everyone I play with. From the bloodstains to their ghostly apparitions, the game is isolating, but it's also ours. Anytime I think of the sad state of the comments section during a main media outlet's weekly Sony versus Microsoft clickbait and get annoyed, I remember the Souls community and smile. Dark Souls 3's references to the past seem to mostly tie directly to Dark Souls 1, the most important ones anyway. It's hard to imagine playing this game without having played one. I'm not being trite when I say this feels more like a real Dark Souls 2. Before there were cycles to linking the fire, there was just the self-contained story of Dark Souls. Once Dark Souls 2 is released and essentially created the same quest, now you have a pattern, and thus it never attempted to become its own story. It had lofty ideas of a decayed kingdom and a monarch who was just and then corrupted and slowly withered away. But in the end, it's still the same. The fire is linked, a cycle is born, and it always felt like that cycle is just a fancy way of saying you're going to be doing the same thing you did last time because you liked that game. They feel more like a coquettish nod to the few who may have preferred Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 1. The strong tradition that Miyazaki passed on from his Souls games is that once again you have a story with multiple outcomes. And I think we will all praise the sun for that. There is an earnest escalation of events in Dark Souls 3 that reminds you at every corner that things are familiar, but they're not immortal. Similar to the chord struck in its progenitor, you can't help but feel sorry for the decay. I remember a strong, downcast feeling after slaying an optional boss named the Old Demon King. Even tasked with bringing down something that is undeniably evil, I found myself reticent after reading the description of its soul of the Old Demon King. The shriveled Old Demon King is now like a clump of burnt ash, but he is the last living witness of the chaos of Izalith. And after reading that, it was hard to think of this encounter as a battle, more like a final farewell. It's that majesty, that illustriousness that was missing in Dark Souls 2 that silently thunders through every corner of every cavern or castle or forest here. Even if it's fleeting, this example of nostalgia isn't pandering. This is brilliant. It's what made Dark Souls a masterpiece. It's what makes Dark Souls 3 the sequel to that masterpiece. There is a constant trajectory of triumph that promises tragedy that echoes through the histories of this world. It's so sad. And even if the detractors say it's familiar, that argument immediately falls apart when everything feels so undeniably appropriate. The ending I chose in Dark Souls 3 was my favorite ending of the entire franchise. I'd be remiss to not admit loudly for all the video game universe to hear that it wasn't sad to see it go. I felt isolated, desolate even, watching the credits roll one last time, but it also felt appropriate. Something closer to peaceful euthanasia than a story, or in this case a world that had overstayed its welcome. If Dark Souls 1 was about the seasons of life, Dark Souls 3 is the winter, the 11th hour. And while I was sad to see it go, the trials, the characters, and the story I experienced on the voyage made such an undertaking quietly and uniquely monumentous. Indeed, this is the way the world ends. Not a bang, but a whimper.